Hello everyone, I would like to welcome you all here tonight. I am Eszter Tóth, the President of Central Europe Association, one of the organizers of today's event. And before we start the main discussion, I would like to introduce our organization just in a few words. Central Europe Association was established in 2016 here at Corvinus by students, and it has been operating here ever since. Our main areas of focus are international relations, economics, political science, and regional studies. And we look at the current events of world politics and economics from the point of view of our own region, Central and Eastern Europe. Our goal is to supplement the studies of university students interested about these fields. Our talent program mainly focuses on foreign policy journalism and analysis, and we provide methodological courses for our members in these areas, and they also have the opportunity to publish their articles on our website. Besides that, we organize panel discussions such as this one today, and also exclusive courses for our members about current events of the international world, and also have private discussions with relevant political and cultural figures. And besides that, it is quite important for us to improve the soft skills of our members and provide them with such practical knowledge that they wouldn't be able to acquire during their university studies. However, it will be incredibly beneficial for them during their professional careers. And if you would like to see more events such as today's, follow us on social media such as Facebook or Instagram. Or if you are a student and interested in joining us, we have an admission period right now, and you can apply until the 8th of March. You can also find more information about that on our social media, but also we welcome any questions after this event as well. So thank you so much for your attention, and now I would like to kindly ask Andrew Davidson, the Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy in Hungary, to make his opening speech.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to see so many of you in this packed room here this evening. Tomorrow, as you know, marks a significant moment. It is 1 year since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 365 days since a neighbouring sovereign country was invaded. And that's why we've chosen this evening as an opportunity to get together. We hold the people of Ukraine in our minds as we gather this evening. I think it's worth me mentioning that as Ukraine enters its second year of living under these circumstances of bombardment and invasion, we hold strong our work to secure lasting peace, which respects Ukraine's territorial integrity. And we will hear the case from the panelists this evening, but my contention as a representative of the British Embassy is that the Russian regime have consistently underestimated Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. They've underestimated the unity of Western allies, and as a consequence, we know Russia will lose. So in practice, the shortest route, we hope, the shortest route to end the war and the uncertainty and suffering will be peace on Ukrainian terms. We're very motivated through our diplomatic effort, through our provision of humanitarian assistance, through military aid to Ukraine to advance those goals. And our support on this sobering moment a year on is solid. Our Prime Minister has said just a few days ago that now's the time to support Ukrainian fight for freedom, and it's time to double down on the support of the last year. So it's in this spirit that I'm pleased to introduce the panelists, especially Mark Galeotti, who is a renowned author, lecturer, and expert on modern Russia and visiting from the UK. It's a pleasure to have him here this evening. I'm also very grateful to the institution and the students of Corvinus University for hosting us, for participating, to the Central European Association, and very much to Political Capital for organising a programme of events for Mark Galeotti. So I hope this evening provides a moment to reflect on a year on, and a moment to test our own thinking, each of us, on all of these topics. It's a pleasure to introduce the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Krista Bombera. I'm a Hungarian broadcast journalist, and it's my honor to have the chance to moderate the panel with our distinguished guests and the three other distinguished Hungarian panelists soon. First, let's have the presentation of our guest, Professor Mark Galeotti, whom I would like to introduce a little longer, but shortly. Professor Galeotti has a consultancy called Mayak Intelligence, and he's an honorary professor at the University College London's School of Slavonic and East European Studies. He is a renowned expert in modern Russia, as you have just heard, especially in security, politics, intelligence services, and criminality. He is also a senior non-resident fellow of the Institute of International Relations, Prague, and an associate fellow at the Council of Geostrategy. His most recent books include Putin's Wars, The Weaponisation of Everything, We Need to Talk About Putin, or the Vory, Russia's Super Mafia. The professor will give us an analysis of the future economic trends and the political implications of the three major players in our focus today: the prospects and the future of Russia, of Ukraine, and Europe. In details, please welcome our guests.
Well, I am delighted to be back in Budapest after too many years. My apologies that I have a cold, so I shall try not to croak. Plus, of course, you always know you're in an academic institution when they give you a time limit for how long they want you to talk, without a single clock being visible. So, hence the phone. Okay. So, exactly as we all know, we are 1 year, near enough, into this terrible war. And although clearly I have no magic crystal ball which gives me sort of detailed knowledge, what I thought would be most useful to try and project 1 year out, so 1 year further. And whether or not there will be a war still raging, my honest answer to that would be it's 50-50, which is the way to try and sound smart when you're admitting you have no real idea. I wish I knew the date when it would end. I don't. Well, what I would say is this. First of all, I actually have a genuine conviction that Ukraine will win. The question is, how long will it take? And equally as important, what does winning mean? I mean, this is one of the problems, and I have to say this is one of the indictments I have for the West, is that we're all supporting Ukraine. Well, most of us. But supporting for what? To what end? We have this mantra that says the war ends when Ukraine says it ends. Well, to a degree, but frankly, in my experience, when I talk to policymakers on either side of the Atlantic, when they're off the record, they're very quick to admit that, of course, that's not the case. Of course, the West has its own interests. There are lines that different Western countries would not want to cross. But we want to avoid that tough debate within the West about how we see the end game, about what does the world look like when the war is over. So, let me look at, as you've heard, Ukraine, Russia, and Europe, 1 year on. Let's say Ukraine wins in that period, with all the little asterisk about whatever wins means. What are we likely to see? Well, look, let's note that Ukraine 1 year ago had many problems, ranging from corruption to social division or whatever. Many of these problems have been dramatically addressed. There is a bizarre irony that one could argue that the father of the modern Ukrainian nation is Vladimir Putin. I don't think they'll be putting many statues to him up, admittedly. But under this terrible hammer blow of war, so many of the old divisions between East and West Ukrainian, Orthodox and Catholic, Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking, they now seem to matter so much less. That said, there will, of course, be a whole variety of systemic issues still to address. But the point is, what we have is a situation in which actually, up to now, it's precisely been, I would say, the disunity of Ukraine that has impeded all the previous attempts at building a proper, genuine Ukrainian nation-state with working institutions. Now they have that basis. I would suggest that, although obviously picking up the pieces after this terrible war will be a hard, long process, but nonetheless, it gives them an opportunity that they have not yet had ever since 1991 to genuinely address these issues. Again, look, I really don't want to make it sound so nice and easy and neat. As I say, it will be a long process. But in this respect, I think Ukraine will have an alternative to its past model of two-thirds state building that then fell back. Okay, so that's assuming that the war is over. What about if the war isn't? Which is entirely possible. And I will come in a moment to the circumstances under which I think that the war is likely to continue. And actually, I suppose if I'm really honest, I think it's more 60-40. That a year from now, we could be meeting in the same room and still talking about the Russian-Ukrainian war. But I'd like to be optimistic. But okay, if the war is still raging, it will have been hard. I mean, one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have been able to sustain this fight and outperform everybody's assumptions and expectations about their ability to resist Russian invasion has been, along with the clear determination, the ingenuity that they've shown and so forth, the fact that Ukraine is fully mobilized. There are not the spare young men who can be sort of swept up to the same level as Putin with his 143 million strong population in a Ukraine of just over 40 million. Now again, I don't see this as an absolute limit. I think we're already seeing the Ukrainian forces restructure for a different type of war. Up to now, they've essentially been fighting an attritional, artillery-heavy war. And don't worry, I won't be going too much into military minutiae. But still, up to now, they've relied on having large numbers of soldiers and large amounts of ammunition to throw. Well, they can't afford to continue to use so many soldiers. And to be blunt, we're beginning to run a bit low on ammunition to provide them. As a response, the Ukrainians are now shifting to a combined arms approach. This is why it mattered so much when we had the recent debate about Western-designed tanks, the British Challenger 2s being pledged, the German-designed Leopard 2s, the American M1 Abrams. These and the associated armored vehicles for infantry and self-propelled guns will allow the Ukrainians to fight a different, much more mobile form of warfare, which doesn't rely on huge artillery bombardments, doesn't rely on huge numbers. So already there is adaptation continuing. And so there is actually every reason to be optimistic that although one hopes that the Ukrainians will not be fighting in a year's time, they will be able to be fighting in a year's time. Much the same is true of the economy. Let's be blunt, the economy is largely being kept on life support by huge amounts of Western assistance. But the point is, it is on life support. And actually, it is working surprisingly well in those circumstances. I mean, again, the Ukrainian capacity to adapt to often extraordinarily difficult circumstances has truly come to the fore. Politically, despite the fact that Zelensky has challenged so many expectations, I mean, I remember talking to some fairly extreme nationalists before the war who were absolutely convinced that Zelensky, the actor, as they called him, would not have the spine to be able to deal with any major crisis. Well, I think he has demonstrated that he has that spine. But still, he faces challenges from nationalists who, to a degree, will try and constrain his options when he gets a chance to talk to peace, and just simply the realities of a population who will inevitably begin to tire. But again, the point is he has demonstrated his capacity to mobilize and enthuse. He is, in my opinion, it sounds beginning to sound rather too much like a commercial, but he is the right man in the right place at the right time for this. So I think, although I would not wish another year of war on the Ukrainians, there is every evidence that they are considering that as a potential, perfectly viable potential risk, and are already now making the kind of adaptations that will allow them to be continuing the fight in a year's time. But of course, what is the real Achilles heel of the Ukrainian war effort? It's us. And this is something that Putin has identified. Russian forces, in my opinion, have already started their spring-summer offensive. We had a tendency to assume that it was going to be some single great hammer blow, and instead it's a whole variety of smaller attacks intended to probe the Ukrainians, put them under pressure, see where there are opportunities. Probably the city of Bakhmut will fall. Maybe some other towns and villages will fall to the Russians. I don't honestly imagine that they will make much territorial gains, though. But in some ways, that's not the point. The point of this offensive is, yes, of course, I mean, if any more cities and towns are taken, Putin will be happy with that. But above all, it is to show that Russia is still in the fight. Putin has identified us as the weak link and is essentially trying to outlast us. Remember, he regards us as essentially morally bankrupt hypocrites who have trouble holding on to our unity, holding on to our attention on anything, really. We are the ultimate attention deficit disorder society. Today, we are focused on this issue, and this is the absolutely crucial issue, and this is all shiny. Something else distracts us. That's his notion of the West. And, okay, he's not totally wrong. His view is precisely that he needs to basically say to the West, I can keep this up as long as you want. Are you willing to keep spending what it'll cost to keep the war on? Now, I don't actually think that he can outlast the West. In terms of the unity we've seen, particularly from the United States, where actually, despite the high-profile interventions from some Republicans, there is a very, very striking consensus across the Republicans and the Democrats to continue to support Ukraine. And also, it understates the degree to which pressures are building up within Russia. But nonetheless, that's his strategy, because that's the only strategy he's got. He is not in a position in which he can beat the Ukrainians on the battlefield. It really is as simple as that. Individual small-scale victories, yes. The kind of larger victory that would allow him, for example, to conquer the whole of the Donbass region, there is no evidence that that is within Russia's capabilities, not its practical ones. It's all very well to say this is a population of 140 million, but at the time when the Ukrainians are increasingly deploying a very 21st century army, Russia is increasingly deploying a 1970s Soviet army, with rusted tanks being pulled out of stockpiles. They do not have infinite capabilities. So what else is going on in Russia? And where might we see ourselves in a year's time? Well, let's be perfectly honest. This is an authoritarian regime which is able to mobilize resources, suppress any kind of resistance, and is already militarizing both the economy and society. These are the kind of measures that you do not for a war that you think will last a month or two, but for a war that you think will last a year or two or three or more. And in this respect, what Putin is doing is almost dragging Russia back to the 1970s. Soviet Union, where you actually have an increasingly bankrupt economy, and yet which political control ensures that more and more resources go to try and support an unsustainable military machine. But this is not the 1970s. And this is not the Communist Party that is in power. We're already beginning to see instances of local political resistance, largely driven by economic troubles. I mean, on one level, the Russian economy has dealt with this crisis amazingly well. I mean, the true heroes of the Russian Federation who should be getting their medals are not all these butchering war criminals. They're actually the technocrats, the central bankers and so forth, who have done an astonishing job, a depressingly astonishingly good job, at dealing with the impact of sanctions. But nonetheless, sanctions are working. Sanctions are a slow, grinding instrument. Those people who pretended that economic sanctions within a couple of months would have brought Putin to his knees did everyone a massive disservice. That's not how sanctions work. But on the other hand, what sanctions are doing is precisely, increasingly they're denying the Russians the high technology equipment they need for the cruise missiles that slam into Ukrainian cities and electricity stations. Eating away at those huge financial reserves that Putin had built up. And increasingly force tough decisions. Putin is a man who, in the main, has in the past been able to throw money at his problems. Whether it's public unrest, whether it's the need to develop the military, whatever, he can throw money at them. Well, no, the money is beginning to run out. We're already seeing that with this coming year's budget. The amount of money which is available for subsidies to the regions is under increasing pressure. More and more Russians are going to experience that. Again, a slow grinding process. Most Russians now have used up all of their savings. Most Russian families have no savings left because of higher food prices. People will begin to notice the roads are more potholed, the hospitals are dirtier, that there's fewer fire engines at the fire station. All of these little things, because the money is going elsewhere. The money is going for the war and the security machine. Now, again, that will not suddenly get people in the streets. Do the Russians support this war? It's obviously hard to guess. Look, this is an authoritarian regime. Someone comes up to you with a clipboard and asks you for your opinion. People are going to, well, again, old Soviet habits re-emerge very quickly. People know if they're going to say an unpopular opinion, it might be dangerous. Still, tens of thousands of Russians have been brave enough to protest. They've been imprisoned, they've been beaten, they've been fined. But most Russians are keeping their head down. Maybe a quarter are still supporting the war, approximately. About a quarter are opposed to the war. And a half, they're trying desperately to avoid having any opinion about the war, because opinions in this kind of a system are dangerous things. It's not going to be protests about the war that actually begin to cause problems. It's going to be protests about the economic situation. And again, if we're talking about a year out, we saw quite a few stresses this past winter. But again, there was enough money in the war chest to deal with it. Well, next winter is going to be even harder. And we're probably going to see less capacity to actually subsidize different sectors of the economy and so forth. Excuse me. So I think by that point we will begin to see the signs of trouble. And does it mean that I think Putin will be swept away by a popular rebellion? No. What it means is that the kleptocrats, the thieves who run this system, the pragmatic opportunists, and the security apparatus that they rely on to do their dirty work will increasingly be faced with tough choices. Do they really want to hold the line? Or is Putin beginning to become dangerous? We're already seeing a strand of opinion within ultra-nationalist circles in Russia that actually sees Putin as the problem. That they didn't have a problem with invading Ukraine, but they have a problem with it being done so damn badly. The corruption, the incompetence, the amateurism, which has been on display, and so it begins to become patriotic to be anti-Putin. All it takes then is a spark. This is what I think is happening. Russia is getting hollowed out. The resources on which Putin relied in the past, the money, the loyalty of the kleptocrats, the continued repression of the security forces, all of those are beginning to come into doubt. And a system like that can still continue for quite some time. But what it does mean is when there is some kind of systemic crisis, then that's when it all becomes suddenly visible. And frankly, think of 1989. Think of how regimes that could look tough and resolute and brutal can suddenly collapse because essentially cynical pragmatists who today felt that their best option was to support the regime, tomorrow think, I don't want to be the last person who jumped ship. Finally, the West, briefly. Of course, sanctions have a price. Let's not pretend otherwise. We would all wish this war would just go away. We all have better things we can spend money on. I'm sure 97% of the people in this room could think of other things that they could spend money on. But that's the way of war. We have chosen a particular form of war, a very 21st century war, an economic, social, political one. Do we want to be spending this money? No. The alternative is to be spending the blood of our young men and women who we would actually send into real fighting, or to more or less say, you know, that world order, that thing that kept the peace for so long, actually we're not that interested. There's a lot of countries, a lot of governments which would be quite happy if we were willing to just basically say, as soon as things get a bit difficult, we'll say no. We'll look after our own interests. And that's fine until it's your interests that suddenly are coming under pressure and you expect to be supported. You know, remember, alliances and relationships like the European Union or NATO, they are not buffets. They're not ones where you can go, I'd like a bit of that, and I like a bit of that, oh no, but I don't want a bit of that. These are about building long-term relationships which are based around trust and faith, that everyone will accept the responsibilities that go with the duties. And in that context, I see Western unity, which was one of the amazing discoveries almost of this war. No one thought that the West could be so united and could be so determined. I think it will continue. Look, in some countries there's more pressure than others. I hesitate to say that basically so long as America is committed, then it doesn't matter too much. That's not quite true. But nonetheless, there is a certain amount of truth in that, given how much money America spends compared with the rest of us. We will face this pressure. However, last point, by doing so, we do two things, maybe three things. First of all, we demonstrate that we actually believe what we say, that the values we claim to espouse actually mean something, novel concept in modern politics, admittedly. Secondly, we ensure that actually we do not have a lasting open wound to Europe's east, because let's be honest, this war will not end without a Ukrainian victory. If anyone believes that actually some kind of, the Russians could take the Donbass and say, that's the end of the war, and the Ukrainians would say, fair enough. No, it's not going to happen. One way or the other, they will continue to be fighting, whether it's suicide bombers, remember the Kerch Bridge, or whether it's actually direct offensive operations. The best chance for peace in Europe is precisely a Ukrainian victory. And the final point, ultimately everyone's security depends on a happy, prosperous, stable Russia. Now, Russia didn't have to cope with its imperial past. This might be the start of that. To appreciate that, in fact, Russia is no longer a great power, that Russia can no longer expect to have an imperial role in Eurasia. That will take some kind of defeat, and this could well be that defeat. Anyway, I have rambled on long enough. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much. We're going to have about 40 minutes for the discussion, and then we're going to have some room for your questions and comments. Let me introduce the guests in ABC order. Professor Dóra Györfi, a professor at Corvinus University of Budapest. Professor Dominik Eszter Tóth, a lead analyst at Altera Public Affairs and founder of Central Europe Association Hungary. Professor Péter Krekó, Director of Political Capital and a Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Since we were asked, or rather you were asked, to focus on predictions and on future trends, political, economical, and on the war front, I would like to ask by a short, soft, subtle reflection on the volatility of predictions, by just generally quickly asking you, what surprised you, if anything, since last February that made you change your mind, made you change your prediction on something that you're pretty confident about? What were you the most surprised by?
Frankly, the war itself. I'll be honest, until about a week beforehand, I thought it was no more than 30.
I'm not sure the mic's working. Let's see. Do we have all the mics turned on? We don't have the sound people here. That one's working.
So, briefly to restart, it was actually the fact of the war itself. Until about a week beforehand, I thought the chances were no more than 30 to 40%. Why? Because it didn't make sense. And it still doesn't make sense, but what I think this demonstrated to us is this. I don't think Putin is insane. I think he believes a certain number of insane things, but that's a different matter. He's a rational actor, but this is evidence of the degree to which a rational actor can still make deeply stupid decisions based on their perception of how the world works and the information that they are presented. And in a way, I mean, obviously, sort of congratulations to all those spies who worked it out, but for those of us who are relying on open source, you know, the one thing we couldn't do is look into that black box of Putin and his inner circle. And in that respect, I gave them too much credit. And there I was wrong.
Well, first of all, it's great to sit here and listen to you and be in this panel. So for me, I was surprised by, you know, I was a bit impatient with the sanctions. You mentioned in your speech that I thought, you know, the West did such a great job in imposing the sanctions. After Crimea, not much happened. There were sanctions, but they were not very tough. Those sanctions worked to some extent, but they were not very extensive. But, you know, after the war started, the sanctions were very fast and were extremely far-reaching compared to what people expected. So I did expect a bigger decline of the Russian economy and a faster impact. I didn't expect that these end the war, but I expected a deeper decline of the Russian economy. And it didn't happen, and it reinforced my belief that, or my conviction that, you know, in social sciences, when you deal with people and you deal with very complex processes, it's really hard to make predictions. However, I also think that sanctions are working. It's just they are slower than we would like them to work.
Good evening, everyone. And getting back to what probably surprised me on the past year of this war and what could probably surprise us going forward in the future is probably, as Mark has already mentioned during his opening lecture, is the tremendous amount of EU unity against Russia. The Russian Federation has gravely miscalculated that level and resilient amount of unity which was shown by the Western Alliance. Russia has done everything, and it has greatly miscalculated its own efforts. It has used the energy blackmail, especially in a Central European perspective. It has done nuclear saber rattling. It has spent years investing in influencing operations against the different countries of Europe, particularly in our region. And of course, this unity will be tested, as it is being tested by the Hungarian government and its anti-sanctions propaganda crusade. But this unity will likely be a defining factor for the short term, and this will be the same for my domain, the Central European region, as well.
Let me raise first, and thanks for all of you, first of all, for coming, and apologies for the ones who have to sit at the back. Given the fact that the capacity of the room is limited, you can only blame Mark for that, because he's just too popular. If he weren't that popular, then you would all have seats. So thanks a lot, Mark, also for coming, and many friends of mine have just asked that, how is it possible that you could bring Mark Galeotti here to Budapest? He could be at the anniversary in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in Paris, in London, which is true. And the secret was that we were calling Mark, asking him if he wants to come, and he said yes. So that's pretty much the story. And I was surprised. So my first surprise was that how easy it was to bring here such a great expert of Russia issues that has an audience all over the world. And let me also thank for the British Embassy for being such good partners in us for us in this whole exercise. And I think the United Kingdom, in terms of financial support, in terms of military support, in terms of moral support to Ukraine, is really exemplary and sets a model. So I'm biased at this point, but I'm really grateful not only for this event, but also that the United Kingdom is so obvious in its line when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, and also thanks for the Central European Association for cooperating us. And a short response to your question as well, not to circumvent that. So what I was mostly surprised at is the three things. One is the unity of the West that Dominic have also referred to. I would say the West, because it's like the transatlantic cooperation has also worked more smoothly than many expected, and definitely against Putin's calculations. Second is the ability of Ukraine to survive. Honestly, I mean, there were a few analysts who predicted that Russia will finally invade Ukraine, but there were almost none, honestly, as I can recall, that Ukraine will be able to resist so far. And 1 year before, no one would have thought that we will sit here in a year and discuss that as a fact almost, that Ukraine is going to win, which is just good to hear, but I think it really exceeded all the expectations. And yes, the third thing that what I would underline is that how easily Europe could get off the Russian gas dependency, and how easily it could switch to other resources without too much political price so far.
Let's get started with predictions and claims and counterclaims that support or undermine them. Let me first ask you about two of the stakeholders out of the three. Let me start with Russia and then Ukraine, and then we're going to talk about Europe as well. Let me ask you about best case scenarios from the very perspective of President Putin and of Ukraine. Let me elaborate a little. Mark said that Putin was really influential. He was winning. He seemed to be strong until he attacked. And then he lost all of it. And also, you said in an interview, in a very specific context, it's important because we're talking a few more lives now, that a miserable and bloody stalemate may be the lesser evil than putting Putin up against the wall radically or somewhat quickly, maybe sufficiently slowly to get him used to the idea and not be stampeded into a panicked and ill-considered reaction. That was a quote from Mark from earlier. So my question is, what do you think may be the best case scenario from the perspective of Putin to get this over with?
I mean, from Putin's point of view, the best case scenario is precisely that Western unity suddenly collapses, that maybe some other crisis suddenly emerges that we agree is much greater or whatever, and that as a result you have countries that are scaling down their support for Ukraine, and more to the point, countries that are then putting pressure to bear on Kyiv, saying you must make compromises because there's, peace must be achieved. and that therefore some kind of ugly deal is arranged, whereby Ukraine hands over the Crimean land corridor, currently occupied territories in the Donbass or whatever. In a way that, let's be perfectly honest, whatever deals are struck, leaves the space open for the Russians to have another go at some point in the future. Because at the same time, the West will probably be ripped apart by recriminations and divisions between countries that are still saying, no, we must support Ukraine, and other countries that say, no, other issues are more important. I mean, I think that would be his dream scenario that he'll be asking Father Christmas for. I don't for a moment believe that's a plausible one, though.
I want to elaborate on why Putin believed that the West support would collapse.
Mic again. Sorry, it's not your fault. Would you change the mic, please? Okay. This is going to be our game.
Okay. Okay. So I also agree that Putin is dreaming about Western unity collapsing, and I think it's very important to underline why he might hold that belief. Putin has been waging a war against the West since 2012 or 2014 in his mind. So basically, what he did is attacking via social media, attacking via Russian propaganda, attacking via strategic corruption, and basically he was making deals with European, American politicians, businessmen, academics, and financing them via this dark money. Billions of dollars flew to the West from Russia. So I think what he saw is that many politicians, many policymakers can be easily corrupted. Then once they are corrupted, they can be easily forced to represent Russian interest. I read there was a Security Council meeting in the Kremlin a year ago, two days before the invasion, and the Kremlin published the transcript of that meeting. And basically Dmitry Medvedev was saying that, well, Ukraine knows that we have so many friends in the West that for the West it's more important to have good relations with Russia than with Ukraine. And they will really believe that. And they had the experience of Georgia, Syria, the Crimea. Basically they could invade without any consequence, and they believed that this would be the same with Ukraine. I also really appreciate the transatlantic alliance coming together in this crucial time, and I also believe that the sanctions were important, not just in punishing Russia and it making harder to finance the war, but the sanctions are very important in terms of self-defense. So once you control the flow of Russian money into the West, once you control the Russian propaganda in the West, you are dealing with self-defense. So that dark money cannot corrupt the Western political systems, that social media propaganda cannot corrupt Western political thinking, and that helps us, and that helps Western unity. So I think sanctions, why they didn't lead to the collapse of the Russian economy, and actually war fuels economic production. They produce tanks and send to Ukraine, and they are destroyed, and they produce new tanks that adds to the GDP. But sanctions are effective in kind of weeding out this dark Russian influence from the Western political sphere, and in that sense, it helps unity. So I think Putin had this idea because of his earlier experience with the West being unable to respond to his manipulations and dark money and dark propaganda, but the war woke up most of the West. Well, we are sitting in Budapest, so not everyone, but but those who matter, really. So I think this is the best case scenario. But because he attacked, because his aims are out in the open and not in the dark anymore, I think he will fail in this illusion. Thank you.
let me take another aspect of your question, Krista, which is the Central and Eastern European region, and what the best possible cases could be for our region, as whatever happens in Ukraine will profoundly impact NATO's eastern flank. And this is particularly important in the sense that the region's underlying significance in the political and security terms is getting stronger. We see a general shift of power, of course a temporary shift of balance of power from the west to the east, largely due to the large support of the Central and Eastern European nations towards Ukraine, as reflected by yesterday's Bucharest 9 summit in Warsaw. And from this point of view, I think the best possible scenario would be if the Central and Eastern European region, particularly the Bucharest 9, would get strong enough to become a deterrent against whatever will be in the uncertainty in Russia in the next years and decades. And this could potentially mean, of course, not just the overall self-strengthening of the region, but the US might be very well looking to increase its footprint in the region, particularly seeing how important this region can become, not only in a temporary sense, but in NATO's overall structure. So this is also, in case of a positive Ukrainian victory, in case of a positive scenario involving Ukraine's victory, which I myself also confident of, I think this could be a next step in the alliance, which would serve our own security interests as well.
In what significant terms, what significant senses would that change the EU dynamics at large?
It has certainly it has certainly done that, particularly when it comes to EU decision-making around, not specifically sanctions, for instance, but when it comes to taking the initiative in foreign and security policy decision-making. We see that in the European Council and the Council of the EU, for example, we have seen this for years, that the Germans and the French, if there is no German or French nod or approval on something, that something will not get through the Council. Now we see that Eastern European countries, quote, new Europeans, unquote, they are much more confident in being part of the European decision-making process. Again, this might be temporary, an unwanted consequence or wanted consequence of the war, but certainly the geostrategic significance of the region is also getting stronger.
And not totally unified. Look at the following part.
There are notable exceptions, of course.
Peter?
Thank you. So I would focus on two aspects of the question. One would be, and the two are strongly interconnected. We have just published an analysis at Political Capital's website and blog on the anniversary of the invasion, and what did we learn, especially in terms of how the public opinion reacts and how politics reacts to all that. And I would say that the surprise in the last year was that the European public opinion is still dominantly behind the sanctions. In most of the member states, the majority is still supporting the sanctions. Let's remember what were the predictions in the autumn, that the winter will totally kill all the solidarity towards Ukraine and all the support towards Ukraine and the sanctions, because there will be energy shortages and the prices will go that high that it will totally, solidarity will totally disappear. And yeah, I think from Budapest we have a bit of distorted perception, but if we take a look at the overall European landscape, this is absolutely not the case. We had an election, for example, in the Czech Republic quite recently, where Andrej Babiš was running a campaign, and the messages might sound a bit familiar, that we should avoid that the other candidate brings us or pulls us into a war, and Poland pulls us into a war, and that the war escalates. So peace is the most important thing. But it didn't really prove to be a winning message. And yes, there will be some other elections. So the first point would be about the public opinion. So the surprise, I think, that the support of the public opinion is still dominantly there. In some countries like Germany, you can see that the support for weapon transfers for Ukraine have declined a bit from about 55% of the population supported it, of the German population in 2022 March, and by December it's declined to 48%, but it's still not something dramatic. It can erode further. But there is another thing that regarding public opinion and the press as well is quite important, I think, and this is Ukraine fatigue. If you take a look at the interest of the public opinion, according to most of the polls, Ukraine is just losing its relevance for a lot of news readers and also a lot of editors as well. And on the one hand, it's a horrible thing because Ukrainians who are suffering, who are under attack, who are fighting a war that we all capitalize from, in the sense that they are defending Europe from Russia, they deserve our attention. But lack of attention on foreign policy is not always a bad thing. So if there is a declining interest, it could also mean that even in countries, and it happened in Bulgaria, for example, where weapon transfers are highly unpopular, they can go along with a policy that is mostly supportive towards Ukraine. So if it receives less attention, it does not mean that pro-Russian forces are going to win. And there will be elections, for example, in Slovakia. There will be elections in Poland. There will be elections in a lot of other countries. Greece, for example. I do not really expect that in any of these elections we can expect a government to be elected that will undermine the unity of the sanctions. And I think we can see it even on the case of Hungary as well, and some other member states, that reluctant member states who really do not like the sanctions are mostly rather supportive. And the political price of breaking the sanctions for any member state would be too high. So my 2 points will be that first, the public opinion support toward the sanctions and weapon transfer might be reduced a bit, but the second one, that it's not a tragedy, because I think the unity of the member states and the European Council will prevail.
Dominic?
Very briefly, just 2 points responding to what Peter has said. First, on elections in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern European member states. We know that most of the governments in this region are run by ideologically diverse, multi-party coalitions. And yes, there have been countries, for instance, in Slovakia and Bulgaria, which, like in Hungary, the public perception towards Russia much be more like here in Budapest than to compare to other nations in the region, such as Poland. But despite this ideological diversity and multi-party governments across the region, it is highly unlikely that this Western unity could be undermined either by the small number of elections that are coming later this year, for example in Slovakia, or the past elections which have happened in recent months. 2024 will be another important year, but that's a different story. But overall, which I would like to emphasize, that despite the domestic political movements, governments come and go in the region. The Slovak government just fell in December. The Moldovan government just fell last week. And the Bulgarian government also fell last summer. These were the results of domestic political infighting, and they do not have really an impact on what is happening in foreign policy at the European level. And this also holds for Hungary as well, which is the other thing I would like to add. I wanted to add quickly. Basically, the West is so united right now that the Hungarian government's foreign policy stance is becoming rather irrelevant at the European table. Of course, there are blackmailing attempts with pro-Caucasus and so forth, just as what we saw in the December European Council summit in Brussels surrounding the EU aid to Ukraine, but Hungary's opposition was largely circumvented. So this unity, at least for now, will prevail.
Mark, let me come back to the best case scenario of the other protagonist of Ukraine now, this time. We know what the maximum claim of Ukraine is. Pre-2014 borders, security guarantees from the West, EU membership. What less of this could be considered a good outcome for Ukraine?
Despite the fact that this is certainly bound to be an unpopular opinion in Kiev, I still think that Crimea may well end up proving to be the crucial element in any kind of a peace deal. I think the rest of the occupied territories, first of all, Russia has no claims to really at all, but also, if we're absolutely honest, Russians don't care about. They don't care about the Donbass. They don't care about Zaporizhia and such like. They do care about Crimea. And I mean, I was always struck. I mean, I was living in Moscow when the annexation vote happened in 2014, and because I was living on one of the big ring roads in the city, I scarcely got any sleep that night. Because all night, Muscovites, and this was not something that was organized by the government, this was a genuine organic movement. They were driving round and round the city all night, blowing their horns, waving Russian flags and so forth. Even people who despise Putin believe Crimea is rightfully Russian. Now, let's be honest, that does not have any kind of bearing in and of itself in international law. However, if we are talking practicalities, first of all, I think a direct Ukrainian attempt to take Crimea, and a military offensive that is actually geared to doing that, would be very hard, and is the kind of thing that might panic Putin into some kind of dangerous overreaction, because I think he would regard that as politically existential. That if he loses, that was really his only true claim to being the kind of great state-building Russian hero of the sort he's constantly paralleling himself. Peter the Great, Ivan the Great, and so forth. These are the people that he thinks of as his peers. Well, the man who briefly held Crimea is not really the sort of historic legend. At best he could be Vladimir, the temporary inadequate. So, I mean, I think that also if the Ukrainians took Crimea, there is a risk that, in fact, we don't really know for sure what the opinion of the Crimeans is these days. But it's possible that a majority would have actually wanted to be part of Russia. And therefore the Ukrainians might well find themselves fighting a counterinsurgency war against people who are not happy being there. So I think there may well have to be some kind of a deal that sees a proper internationally recognized referendum there. A real one, not like the 2014 vote, and one that includes all those people who have had to flee Crimea ever since 2014 to actually decide the future of this peninsula. It would be difficult for Zelensky or any Ukrainian government to agree to that. It might well prove something that is necessary. And this is one of those cases where pragmatism, actually comes in. But the point is, that, I think, is the only issue which ought to be considered possibly open to negotiation. All the other conditions that you mentioned, the return of the occupied territories, a recognition that Ukraine is a sovereign country, and if it wants to join the European Union, if it wants to join NATO, not that I think necessarily it would be needed, but nonetheless, if that is its goal, then that is its right. And also we have to mention reparations. Now again, quite how that is handled, whether that's money coming from Moscow or just simply property and assets of Russia in the West that have been frozen and sequestered, handed to rebuild Ukraine, but one way or the other, that has to be also part of any deal.
Any of the other panelists reflecting on this?
Well, I think what we also need to consider that Ukrainians want justice for the war crime and genocide that Russia was waging against them. So I think some kind of criminal court punishing the perpetrators is very important. And I will also want to call attention to the Ukrainian children who were abducted to Russia. We don't know the exact numbers. Thousands of children are Ukrainian children are in Russia, and I think that will be the longest and most difficult element.
Which is proper genocide, to call it by its name.
Exactly. To get back those children to Ukraine, and I don't think Ukrainian nation can rest and be in peace without those children going back.
Those are going to be the most painfully difficult things that you've just said.
I think if you take a look at the public opinion polls in Ukraine and Russia, and let me tell, in Ukraine they matter much more. I mean, public opinion matters more in more democratic countries than in less democratic countries. But let's start with Ukraine. In Ukraine, especially after all the news about Bucha and other genocidal cases have emerged, the need for going into a peace with Russia, giving up territories, have declined dramatically. So it's like impossible to sell to the Ukrainian public opinion that that you go into any territorial concessions. And there is an election scheduled to late this year in Ukraine. I don't know if it will be finally organized or will be postponed because of the war, but public opinion definitely matters in Ukraine. In Russia, of course, it matters some as well, a bit less, but and of course the reliability of the Russian polls is a question in itself, but more reliable pollsters such as the Levada Center shows that Putin still has a pretty high level of support, and you do not really see too much willingness, even from the Russian population, to stop the war immediately. And
except that we don't know the validity of the polls in Russia at all.
Of course, it's a question itself. But I don't think that there is this immediate pressure on any of the sides, which for me is rather pointing to that direction. That yes, it might be prolonged to a longer period. And one other point I just quickly wanted to raise is that what we underestimated, I think, in the last 1 year, and we can see that it was clearly a mistake, and this is something that Mark has emphasized a lot in a lot of interviews and discussions, the role of emotions and the role of psychology in policy making, which also means that we just cannot predict the future based on what we think is rational. No one thought that Putin's action to run over Ukraine is rational, and let's just imagine remember how we thought about Putin beforehand, the most pragmatic, most rational leader who is just a KGB agent and socialized there, so he does not have any emotions. He's just the perfect homo economicus, right? It's just can predict everything and it's act rationally. But if you are deprived of the right information, because the system works this way, and if you got trapped into identity, emotions, groupthink, wishful thinking, then this is what you end up to. So I think one more point would be that I think we have to give up this illusion that we can predict the future pretty well, because I think what happens during a war has its inherent unpredictability.
Aside from all the very important aspects we've just heard, let me add just very briefly 2 further points on relating to the best case scenarios for Ukraine. One is, regardless of how Ukraine wins this war, because indeed, as Mark has, for example, and the other panelists also emphasized, we don't know what victory will look like. But if victory happens, Europe and NATO, of course, will have to think further and think of potential security guarantees as well for Ukraine and the region as well. Polish President Andrzej Duda has been pushing for this very, very strongly, but there is a massive debate within the alliance whether this will actually happen. So this is one of the aspects of a positive scenario, which could be life-saving generally, not just for Ukraine, but in some unwanted cases for the region as well. And the other aspect I would like to bring in, which is something which we have not really talked about yet, but it will be by far the topic of the year, and hopefully, and it will materialize, is Ukraine's potential recovery and reconstruction. In order for Ukraine to function, this will have to happen. I know this is something that is very far from right now, but there is a massive amount of expectation for this, for what is expected to be actually one of the biggest economic reconstruction efforts in economic history. And this is something that will be necessary for Ukraine to operate in the future.
Just very, very briefly, actually, just while we're talking about Putin's popularity. Putin historically tends to have approval ratings in the 80%. which are the kind of levels that most Western politicians would perfectly happily sell their own grandmothers to achieve. He also, though, tends to have trust ratings in the 30%, which raises an interesting question. You know, is there actually, about 50% of Russians approve of someone that they don't trust? Well, I think the point is, what we have to realize is probably the trust ratings actually are the real representation of Putin the politician. The approval ratings are Putin the national icon. Remember, this is a man who essentially has been in charge of Russia for 23 years. You know, how many people cannot even remember a pre-Putin era? So I think in some ways we now have a situation in which kind of people say that they approve of Putin because it's almost just like a statement of saying I approve of Russia. But they are able to distinguish between Putin the icon and Putin the politician. And I think this is where we're seeing interesting movement, that it's his trust ratings that are beginning to come under pressure. Because his trust ratings reflect, amongst other things, how well you think he's doing what he said he would do for you. And for most Russians, he's not doing a lot.
Right, that's really strange and really puzzling what you've just said. Didn't know that. Thank you very much. Please allow me to finish the scenario pattern that I built up with Europe with a very specific question. Mark, it was very interesting in your interview with 444 yesterday that Magyari Péter quoted a widely held expert view to you that Europe would not have been able to defend Ukraine without the United States. You supported this view and also added the ramification that with American eyes on Europe again, they seem to have other focuses, but now they're back with a focus in Europe. We Europeans can again postpone becoming self-dependent when it comes to defense. To quote you, Europe is a superpower in trade, but not a superpower when tanks matter. And now we're going to have a decade, you said, to think about this and to make our choices. What does it take for Europe to decide this way or that way, to become self-dependent militarily? Of course, one factor is obvious, American politics, which seem to be very volatile. Think of President Trump. But even President Trump was right in one thing when he said that European countries have been long ignoring their NATO requirements.
Yeah, I remember some years back, while the kind of whole Brexit lead-up was taking place, I had some meetings in the French Ministry of Defense. One was with a very senior, very aristocratic French official, who nonetheless said something that I really wasn't expecting to hear about how worried he was about the potential for Brexit. So that really surprised me. But then it became clear, he was making the point that essentially only 2 European countries have out-of-area power projection capabilities. In other words, the kind of forces, the kind of training, the kind of expertise within their military command structures to be able to deploy forces well away from the European continent. And so his view was that if Brexit happened, which I'm sorry to break it to you, but it did, any future European military deployments would be dreamed up in Berlin, approved in Brussels, and fought by the French. Now, look, in part that's because the French, like the British, are a post-imperial country with the sort of legacy that means, but it also says something about the kind of priorities that have been taking place in Europe. And we have seen that now. I mean, Poland is making a massive investment in its military. You know, the reason why it's so happy to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine is because basically they're going to be replacing them with much more modern South Korean and American ones. This is just a way of getting rid of the old sort of legacy tank park. And they have clearly a strategy of precisely making themselves the military superpower, shall we say, of North Central Europe. But this is the thing, for so long, Europe has been willing to operate under America's umbrella. Now, it's not that actually strategic autonomy means that Europe turns its back on America and breaks NATO or anything like that. Of course not. But on the other hand, it is also actually a requirement for Europe to be serious about this. And that's in part, it's the whole business of reaching that 2% of GDP figure that NATO member countries are meant to reach, which now more and more countries are reaching. It's also, fundamentally a willingness, sadly, to accept that, your boys and girls will die in foreign fields if you actually are willing to run overseas operations. A need to actually coordinate. I mean, you know, how many countries actually still manage to try and maintain their own defense industries, even with PESCO, which is meant to be the sort of unified procurement systems and such like. And last point, I'm struck, I mean, I heard it here in Budapest, I've heard it elsewhere. This sense of, well, Europe, we're stuck between America and Russia. And I'm thinking, poor little Europe. It has a GDP, a combined GDP, an order of magnitude above Russia's. It has more ground troops than Russia has these days. Now, look, I'm not saying that necessarily they're all in the right place and they're all the right sort or anything like that, but nonetheless, Europe has to stop thinking of itself as this kind of weak little subsidiary that has to depend on Uncle Sam. Of course, no one can match the American defense budget, but that is not the only measure of being a serious player. And it may well be that Europe decides that it's happy just simply being a regulatory superpower. Well, that's fine. You know, Europe can be a regulatory superpower, and then I can conquer the whole continent with a butter knife. You know, there are all sorts of different power, and if Europe wants to be a serious player in the future, it needs to operate across a spread of power. So yes, it's regulatory, yes, it's military, yes, it's intelligence power. All of these things have to be present. And up to now, Europe hasn't.
I'm a very firm believer in European integration, and I am usually very, very optimistic. But regarding this building up a European military, I see the normative arguments for it, and I see all the problems that come with not being a military power. But you know, looking at the past 70 years, it's hard to see. So I'm really hoping for the transatlantic alliance to continue and remain strong, and that includes the UK and the US. And I also hope that this period of Donald Trump was, you know, it was the most successful project of Putin, but hopefully the US has woken up, Europe have woken up, and this doesn't happen again.
Catching up where we left, yes, another Trump might have not been even a wake-up call for us, but obviously it should happen that Europe becomes more self-reliant on this term. However, it looks more likely, especially when it comes to the dynamics between the countries of NATO's eastern flank and the United States and the UK, that this will be the security guarantee that will ensure the security of the region going forward.
Yeah, honestly, that may be a bit of provocative here. I really don't think it's that much of a problem that Europe is dependent on American security, and I'm not entirely sure, even knowing that how difficult it is, for example, in Belgium, in Germany, and a whole lot of Western European countries to persuade the public opinion to spend more on military, because the next argument is, okay, you want to take away the money from healthcare, from education, from your children, more people will die, and so on. So I think it is still very difficult, and it is easier, I think, in the Central Eastern part of Europe that is closer to Russia than in countries that are more further. And for me, the last year pretty much the last year was a proof of that. When there is a serious threat, then the transatlantic alliance works rather well. And yes, you mentioned Donald Trump, which is of course important, because there was a decision at his presidency to withdraw troops from Germany, for example, but also it was Donald Trump whose administration first decided to send javelins to Ukraine. So when he was president, I think the Ukraine policy was pretty much in line with the, let's say, Washington consent, even if we can question if it exists or not. So my point would be that the transatlantic alliance, I think, works surprisingly well, and probably it's not just by mistake, and we discussed it in another setting, that the advocates of this idea of European sovereignty and strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty, it's mainly a French foreign policy invention. I think it's not a bad idea in itself, but when the war began, I think these arguments have rather evaporated, and it seems to be that without American arms and weapons, Ukraine would face much more difficult time to defend itself only with the weapons that is receiving from European countries, which is of course a lot, but still. So I don't think that Europe will be able to defend itself without the United States, and I'm not necessarily sure that this is a goal that Europe has to move forward.
But you're not afraid that a more vigorous America first attitude would leave us out in the cold?
I do think that when American presidents are elected, then they are becoming part of a structure, and I don't mean that there are some background powers behind them. I just mean that there is some inertia of the Washington policy making that seems to put presidents, even who argue against, let's say, more transatlantic ties, like Donald Trump did, so they just follow more or less the line. So I think Trump as a president was doing much less against this transatlantic cooperation than many expected, but I might be wrong. Mark, what do you think?
I mean, very briefly, yeah, I think this is the interesting thing. At the end of the Trump era, American policy towards Russia was tougher than it had been at any point since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And to a considerable degree, this was because essentially Congress took over America policy. But it's also because essentially Trump was not going to put his own political capital on the line for anyone else. Trump would throw anyone and anything under the metaphorical bus for his own survival and security. So exactly, so long as the sort of the structures and the consensus in DC was heading one way, he was going to roll with it.
Dominic?
In a nutshell, the same. This inertia, what Peter has mentioned, was the strong bipartisan consensus in the U.S. Congress, which was essentially making the foreign policy instruments of the Trump administration stronger than the second Obama administration. And as long as this consensus remains, I think that NATO will be in good hands, and we will have enough calm when it comes to being concerned about own security in the region.
At this point, I have to strongly apply self-constraint, because I promised the audience to pay respect and give the floor over to you for the last remaining 5 or 10-ish minutes. I'll try to bundle some of the questions together because they might be relevant in some of the answers. 2 of the gentlemen in the back we have already. Let's say like 5 questions together, if you don't mind, and take notes, please, if you think.
Thank you very much. Mark Higgy, Europe correspondent for The Spectator Australia. Terrific presentation. Thank you very much indeed, Professor. Fascinating insights. 2 quick questions, if I may. Number 1, could you give us your take on Seymour Hersh's claims that the United States sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines? Number 2, China hasn't been mentioned. What's your take on claims that China is maneuvering to upgrade its assistance to Vladimir Putin?
Good afternoon, Juan Gonsalves, Georgetown University. 2 questions as well. The first of them is, I believe we're sometimes a bit naive, or we underestimate the ability of Russia to hold on, and time is on Russia's side rather than Ukraine's. We see that Russia has changed their supply chains to India, to China. Being excluded from SWIFT just means that with Iran, they're developing a new financial system to make international payments. Russian oil is being resold in Azerbaijan as Azeri oil. Is really Ukraine, does Ukraine have time on its side when it depends on the coordination of dozens of capitals all over the world for it to continue its current resistance to Russian invasion? And the second question I'd like to ask is, I don't think we've yet talked about a credible exit strategy. What is the compromise, if any, the denominator which can imply a negotiation when it's existential for the political leadership of Russia to come out with a victory, and it's existential for the nation of Ukraine to come out with a victory as well? What can we learn from other examples of mortal enemies next to each other around the world? The Koreas, the Indias, the Pakistans, Israel, Palestine. Thank you.
Let's have one more member of the audience.
I'm Jonathan Wiggin. I'm a writer. I live here in Budapest, and I lived for many years in Russia, where I ran quite large Russian companies. Dominic mentioned, I thought it was very interesting, about the shift of power towards Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, as a result of the Ukrainian war. I'd be very interested to hear the panel's thoughts on where that leaves countries who have been ambivalent or circumspect in their support for Ukraine during this period. In fact, the panel's been very circumspect themselves about talking about Hungary in that respect. So I'd mention Hungary, Serbia, and I'd also be interested in that, sort of connected to that, your thoughts on the Balkan area as well, and Russian influence operations there, and how that's going to play out as they perhaps move their attention into other areas where they may look for cracks, as it were, and look for ways to deflect attention. Thank you.
And please excuse my gender sensitivity, but we did have a female member of the audience whom I would like to give the last chance to ask a question before we enter.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Yulia. I'm originally from Ukraine, from the Donbass actually, but I work for a political risk intelligence company, Millennium Emerging Europe. And my question, I guess, is quite simple. Like, as any Ukrainian, I'm very grateful to the West for all support, but, you know, as President Zelensky mentioned that all the time, it's not enough. And sometimes it feels like, you know, the supplies have been so slow and gradual not to allow Ukraine to win or to achieve outright victory. So, and obviously, Ukraine needs jets, Ukraine needs long-range missiles, and it feels like all of that depends on something. If it's the Western Red Lines or it's Ukrainian battlefield success. So I would really appreciate your thoughts on that, because obviously everyone is talking about potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. So will it change something? What will happen? Or will it lead to the supplies of jets and long-range missiles, or it will not? So yeah, it would be interesting to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, tough and good questions. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'll try and get through these very quickly. Spectator Australia, you're a long way from home. I regard the Seymour Hersh allegations as middling ludicrous. I mean, first of all, the practical specific details that were made, the claims about the presence of ships in certain areas at certain times, the presence of a Neptune aircraft, you know, open source has proven that that didn't take place. I am still, I think the most, for me, plausible answer is actually that the Russians did this to demonstrate their capability. It's a lot safer and easier to show you have a capability on your own pipelines that you know are not going to be used, so they keep one open in case the Germans relent and want to buy gas, rather than doing it immediately onto another countries, which could be considered an act of war. But I think they're just pointing out, you have pipelines, you have underwater internet cables, and we have the capability to break them. China, again, I'm a little bit skeptical, because up to now, the friendship without limits of China and Russia has proven to be a friendship without benefits. And the Russians have been very unsuccessful in basically getting any kind of meaningful Chinese support, except when it's entirely in China's interests. China has helped magnify the Russian propaganda campaign in the global south, saying that this is an anti-imperial war. Nonsense, but there you go. China has closed a blind eye to money laundering and smuggling through China, but it's not done anything to jeopardize its massive trade with the West, and I don't think it will, because actually, in some ways, this war is a win-win for them. Should the Russians win, which I don't think they will, then the West will descend into recrimination and uncertainty. Should the Russians lose, then they actually find themselves more and more Chinese vassals in effect. So I mean, we might find some Chinese artillery shells finding their way into North Korea and turning up in Russia as quote-unquote North Korean artillery shells, but that's about the limit to what I imagine we'll see. Russian ability to hold on. As I said, I mean, I think we shouldn't underestimate the stresses on Russia. There's a certain kind of cliche about, well, you know, the tough Russian mujik and so forth. This is not Stalingrad. The capacity to mobilize people with the claim that this is an existential struggle for Russia is not really working, because exactly there are no German legions smashing their way through you know, Belarus and Ukraine. And an exit strategy, well, I mean, I think at the moment the problem is that both sides think time is on their side. The Russians think that the longer they drag this on, then the more chances of the West fragmenting, and the Ukrainians think the longer they drag it on, the more territory they'll take back. In this kind of context, well, fine, so, you know, the political leadership may regard a victory as an existential need for Russia. I see no particular reason to give them that. Quickly, I won't talk about shift of power, because that's, I'm not a Central Europe specialist and others are. Influence in the Balkans, general point. You know, so much of Russia's influence has turned out to be based on what Russia offers. Basically, it didn't so much buy influence, but it did rent it. And that depends precisely on your capacity to provide things, whether it's free jets to the Serbians, or whether it's money to buy off politicians, as we've heard. You know, in Central Asia, where Russia was regarded as the security guarantor of choice, all of a sudden no one's looking at Russia. And if anything, they're actually trying to pressurize a reluctant Beijing to begin to play some kind of a role there. Armenia, which had put its faith in Russia, is no longer thinking that Moscow is going to bail it out. So I think likely we'll see in the Balkans as well. Sure, you can still rent some Balkan politicians at surprisingly reasonable rates, but you should only assume that they will do the minimum they have to, and only as long as you can continue to pay them, and no one else is offering a better deal. And very finally, the whole kind of not enough narrative and on what it depends. Yes, I mean, first of all, let's be perfectly honest. There is a degree to which actually Western military aid is calibrated to try and have some kind of influence on Ukrainian policy. No, I mean, let's recognize that as a reality. Jets, I honestly don't think that actually Ukraine does need F-16s at the moment. But one of the brilliant ways that Zelensky plays the West is by asking for things that he knows he won't get and doesn't necessarily need. And then when we say no to that, we have to say yes to other things. I remember talking to an MP on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee who was kind of grumbling, half exasperated and half impressed, because he says precisely, you know, Zelensky forces us to use up our one no on something we weren't going to give him anyway. And as a result, he gets things that we weren't otherwise planning to do so.
I want to reflect on two questions regarding the reorientation of trade to India and China. China and India have been buying up a lot of energy from Russia, but this has hit its limit because they have been buying it at a sharp discount, and there are no pipelines, and maritime transport is very difficult. So once Europe stops buying energy, Russia will have difficulty selling it, and energy incomes have gone down. Regarding Hungary, yes, we have to talk about it, and we cannot you know, ignore the question. I want to be very clear. Well, Hungary didn't mess up the alliance. It didn't have the power to do so. I'm very glad for that. It has a horrible reputation, and our government deserves that. And it chose the wrong side, or seemed to be choosing the wrong side, as several times in the past. And we will have to suffer it, and we will have to deal with the shame for a generation, how this country has behaved, and well, some of us know that. I am very grateful to Ukraine for keeping the defense, because things could have been so much worse for Hungary as well, not just Russian attack. I found one of the most disturbing elements of this war when Polish, Ukrainian and Slovakian politicians were talking about plans that, you know, once Putin succeeds in Ukraine, Hungary is going to take Transcarpathia. That's horrific, and I'm glad that we didn't have to test this hypothesis. So we will have to deal with the shame, and probably Hungarian companies will not be able to participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine as all the other countries in Central Europe, and that's completely deserved. So that's a task for us Hungarians for the next decade.
Just very briefly, since we don't have much time left, I'd like to respond only to the question which was directed at me. At first, for the shift of power in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. If there is a permanent shift of power towards the east, the countries that will be the most favored in this direction are basically the Visegrad 4 minus Hungary, the Baltics, and Romania. And these countries remain by far the best positioned, in addition to the US and the UK, to take part in the reconstruction. As for Hungary itself, our government is not as relevant on the international arena as Prime Minister Orbán wants it to be, and that is why, again, I am confident that Western unity will remain, at least for the short term, when it comes to supporting Kyiv. And as for the Balkans, by profession I'm not a Balkans expert, but our regional affairs consultancy recently published an analysis and an outlook for the region, and it starts with this. If the Russian-Ukrainian war were about to escalate somewhere, geographically speaking, the Balkans, given its historical background, would provide a fertile ground. And if Russia were to use the Balkans to exploit, to gain advantages against the European Union, there are three things it could basically exploit: Montenegro's heightened nationalism, Serbia's multiple tensions with its neighboring countries, and the questioned territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Just very briefly, on the point of weapon transfers to Ukraine, and I'm dissatisfied with how European countries react, and also I totally understand if you feel that it's too little, too late, too hesitant. On the other hand, to be a bit more optimistic as well, a lot of taboos have been broken in Europe in the last year. For example, Germany is deciding to provide tanks for Ukraine in a period, as I told beforehand, when in the public opinion the support for that has started to decline. I think the case is something similar in France. Countries that have public opinions that are culturally, historically much more tied to Russia and also linguistically, like let's say Bulgaria, Slovakia, have decided to send weapons to Ukraine. Okay, it won't be a game changer in itself, but I think it's an indicative of what Dominic have just said, that Central Eastern European countries and Baltic countries have and Ukraine have become norm setters in the European scene. And I think right now, if we take a look at